Time to check in with Dr. Joe Schwarz. He is host of the Dr. Joe Show, Sundays at 3 here on CJAD 800, and also, of course, director of the McGill Office for Science and Society. So, Joe, story, I guess I'm not sure where I heard about it this week, but it's come up before, the idea of food additives and why, depending on where you live in the world, some food additives are allowed and some are banned. So what's the story and where does Canada fit in on this?
It is an interesting story, and the reason that it was in the news this week is that Marketplace, usually, an excellent CBC program, looked at titanium dioxide, which is a food colorant that is allowed in foods in Europe, but it's not allowed in Canada. So the question is, how do different countries come to different conclusions looking at the same data? And it is because of the way that data is interpreted. In Europe, they have a different outlook. They go by what is called the precautionary principle, which means that if there's any hint of any kind of risk, whether it be a laboratory study or an animal study or whatever, you pay attention to that and you err on the side of caution and you don't use the substance. Canada has a different view. In Canada, what Health Canada dictates is that it's not enough to know whether or not, in theory, something can cause a problem in the laboratory in an animal. What we really need to do is have an in-depth look on what this means for humans. So here we look at studies that are relevant to humans. And when you take a look at the evidence, there is no evidence at all that this substance, titanium dioxide, which is used as a white colorant in many different foods, poses a danger to humans. So a laboratory study is different than looking at people, and we also know that the human is not a giant rat. So you can't just extrapolate from animal studies. So I think we have a more realistic view here. Of course, it's debatable, and this thing is often debated, not only about titanium dioxide, but many other substances. But I think the evidence does support Health Canada's position that in this particular case, there is no issue with titanium dioxide. On the other hand, I am absolutely not in favor of adding any kind of food colorant to foods, not because I'm suspicious about the safety of the colorant, but I'm suspicious about the foods to which these things are added. You will not find titanium dioxide in an apple, in an orange, in lettuce, in kale, or in a tomato. You will find it in things like cake decorations, you'll find it in gummies, you'll find it in candies, you'll find it in foods that have no nutritional benefit. So I would say that there is reason to avoid titanium dioxide, not because I think that this is a dangerous substance, but because it is used in foods that we should be limiting anyway. I think that's a much better way to look at it. Life can go on without indulging in gummies and Skittles and Smarties and M&Ms.
Wait a sec, Joe. Don't get crazy. M&Ms? We're going to just no more M&Ms?
No, I don't say no more.
It's a little over the top, I think.
M&Ms, but okay. I don't make them a regular part of my diet.
Okay. But can I ask a question, though, as you talk about this, sort of from a serious perspective? The fact that food additives, the whole idea, I'm guessing, a generation or two ago, we weren't paying much attention, didn't really have the science that could let us know. Are you seeing in general, though, fewer and fewer food additives being used?
I think there's more attention being paid to them, and there's more scrutiny of them. But it also depends on, what class of additives we're talking about. Because some, like preservatives, have obvious use. We don't want bacteria in our food. We don't want fungi in our food. But that's quite different from using, let's say, red dye number 3 to color a candy. So, yes, there is a lot more scrutiny on substances that are not critical to safety of the food supply. And also, of course, as time marches on, we gain more knowledge. For example, 10 years ago, no one would have been talking about the microbiome. That is all the bacteria that are found in our gut. Today we know that they're not just bystanders, they interact with the body. And there are some health issues here. So for example, emulsifiers, which are widely used food additives because they allow oil and water to mix. Now we find out that they can interfere with the composition of bacteria in our gut, and not in a positive way. But of course, we never knew about this before. So, until quite recently, no issues were ever raised about emulsifiers. But we get more and more knowledge as time goes on,
right?
Which of course also means that we have more and more worries. And that's why it is so important to know how to filter the information and know what is worth worrying about and what is not.
Well said. All right, let me move on. I want to talk this because I just saw this headline. I want to get your take. So we all know about the Mediterranean diet. It's supposed to be the one that's healthiest for you. And now the Atlantic diet is apparently the new rival to the Mediterranean diet. What do you know about this?
Well, this is a diet that supposedly is consumed in northern Portugal and northern parts of Spain. And like the Mediterranean countries, this area actually does have a low incidence of heart disease compared to northern and eastern European countries. So the question is, what does the diet have to do with it? So we look at this so-called Atlantic diet, and it does differ from Mediterranean diet in that it doesn't have much olive oil, and not as many nuts and fruits are consumed. And they do eat a lot of red meat, a lot of bread, and they eat a lot of pork. But the key components of this Atlantic diet are cod, red meat, dairy products, legumes and vegetables, and there's a type of vegetable soup called caldo verde. They eat a lot of potatoes, a lot of whole grain bread, as I said, and they drink wine. So why is it that we're even looking at this diet? And that's because interesting research in Porto, Portugal, was carried out, a so-called case control study, where patients admitted to a hospital after a heart attack were questioned in quite some detail about their diets by trained interviewers. And they compared the results to randomly selected subjects from the same area who had no evidence of heart disease. And they looked at each food component and, which was consumed more in the heart disease group and relative to the other group. And it turned out that if they followed this Atlantic diet that I mentioned, they did better, except that if you factor out the red meat and the potatoes, then they do even better. So,
okay.
So I don't think there's really a whole lot to be gained by looking at this Atlantic diet, other than the fact that it does feature a lot of legumes and vegetables. But the attention of the media turned to the fact that they eat a lot of red meat. So, they try to justify this. But the fact is that when you factor out the red meat in this study that was carried out in Porto, the people who had a heart attack consumed more red meat than the control group.
Well, so much for that. All right. Dr. Joe, thank you very much. Appreciate it. We'll talk to you again next week.
Okay. Thanks, Aaron.